Greetings and welcome to Fox Hill. I'm Barry Weber, Executive Director of the Norfolk Historical Society. Today, we're going to take you on a tour of this magnificent historic property. Welcome to the Hall of Fox Hill. This is the only remaining room from the magnificent castle that the Bridgemans built. These beautiful leaded glass doors behind me would have brought visitors into this grand room, all covered with oak paneling that was noted in its day for its magnificent detail. Here, in front of the enormous fireplace, we have an enlarged photograph of Fox Hill in the middle of a Norfolk winter. So you can imagine the blazes coming out of this fireplace. These giant andirons, original to the building, are said to have two men brought the logs to fill this fireplace. And it would have taken two men to handle those tools. So come with me as we venture on and explore more of what was Fox Hill. Recently, the Griswold family, descendants of the original owners of Fox Hill, donated an extensive amount of new materials to the Norfolk Historical Society, which prompted us to produce this video. Fox Hill was designed for Alice and Henry Bridgeman in 1895 by the famed architectural firm Cady, Berg & C. Two of the firm's most notable works in New York City are the Museum of Natural History at Central Park West and 77th Street, and the original Metropolitan Opera House, which occupied the block between 39th and 40th Street on Broadway. The firm was very prolific, with commissions ranging from shingle-style architecture in the Adirondacks to Trinity College, Cady's alma mater, and Yale University. Josiah Cleveland Cady was no stranger to Norfolk. He had been commissioned by Robbins Battelle and his sister Anna to design the Robbins School in 1884. He also designed the music room addition and art gallery at White House for Robbins Battelle, and in 1885 for Robbins' sister Urania Battelle Humphrey, Norfolk's beautiful Battelle Chapel, which was dedicated in 1888 to their parents, Joseph and Sarah Battelle. So it is no surprise that the Bridgemans would choose this notable firm for their new and imposing residence. But let me backtrack a moment and fill you in on some family history. Alice Bradford Eldridge, born in 1851, was the fifth and youngest daughter of Joseph and Sarah Battelle Eldridge. The Eldridge daughters were all well educated. Mary, Isabella, and Alice all attended Miss Porter's school in Farmington, Connecticut. They were also well traveled, as the family fortune had provided for them, so the sisters often went abroad. The Eldridge sisters were, as we all know, great benefactors to their beloved hometown of Norfolk. Sister Isabella gave the town a library. Mary and Isabella built one of the first public golf courses, the Norfolk Downs. And Mary commissioned Stamford White to design a fountain on the town green in memory of her uncle Joseph Battelle. And in 1892, Alice commissioned Henry Rutgers Marshall to design a gymnasium for the townspeople, which quickly became the center of cultural life in Norfolk at the turn of the new century, both for the locals and the influx of new summer visitors. Around this same time period, Alice, now age 42, meets and marries Henry Harrison Bridgeman, who was 10 years her senior. The wedding was touted as the event of a lifetime for Norfolk. The Winstead citizen writes, "An elaborate wedding. The marriage of Miss Alice B. Eldridge to Mr. Henry H. Bridgman took place in the Congregational Church at Norfolk, Connecticut, at 4 p.m. this afternoon. The church, which was filled to overflowing, many not even finding standing room, had been elaborately trimmed by Thornley, the New York decorator. The profusion of flowers and their tasteful arrangement made a magnificent display, one never seen or attempted here before, and one never to be forgotten. Promptly on time the wedding party marched up the aisle to the wedding march. The bridegroom was attired in conventional dress suit prescribed for such an occasion. The bride was dressed in white satin gown trimmed with point lace flounces and point lace veil, with spray of orange flowers and a diamond spray pearl necklace with a pendant, a gift of the groom. After the ceremony performed by Mr. Depew, the family and friends returned to the residence of the bride, which had been very tastefully decorated by Thornley, and found that Sherry, a caterer from New York, had taken charge of the new dining room and spread an elegant wedding breakfast, to which full and ample justice was done. The presents, of which there was the greatest abundance, many of them being very rare and valuable, were then viewed, after which the friends from New York took a special car which brought them for their return, and the bride and groom started for a short trip to Boston and vicinity. The wish that joy and prosperity may go with them and remain with them is echoed from every heart where they are known." Upon returning to Norfolk from their honeymoon, they took up residence in a cottage on Litchfield Road and began their endeavor to build a home on the hill. The Bridgmans selected a site about a mile south of the village green and up on the side of a hill, where the house would be above the town facing west, and also north and south. Made of brick and local Connecticut marble, it was an enormous project for its day. The plans were approved early in 1894, and construction began. The cost of construction for Fox Hill was $65,000. Isabel Battelle Bridgman was born in the house on December 4th, 1896. In those days, doctors came to your house. She was delivered on a large table in the center of the linen room. Her brother Eldridge, LeBaron Bridgman, had been born 2 years earlier, on April 24th, 1894, on the same table. He and his younger sister Isabel grew up in this chateau-like home with a large staff. Their parents were contemporaries of their friends' grandparents and were usually away. Henry Bridgman had retired, and he and Alice traveled much of the time and went to Europe regularly. The children were raised by servants and were sent to an assortment of schools. Miss Masters' School in Dobbs Ferry, New York, is the one Isabel attended the longest. She also went to a school in Lausanne, Switzerland. The Norfolk Chimes reports this in 1897. One of the most picturesque scenes as one comes into Norfolk on a westbound train is the dove-colored outline of the new Bridgman residence with its backdrop of green foliage. The extensive grounds about this handsome stone residence, which is without equal in Litchfield County, have within the past few weeks been completed, the work being done under the direction of Olmsted and Elliott of Boston. The Bridgmans continued to travel and purchased furnishings from all over the world for their new home. The family tradition of patronage continued with Alice's added alliance to Henry Bridgman. The elegant home provided a platform for entertaining, and the list of distinguished guests will amaze you. First, let me tell you more about the house. One of the recent artifacts we received from the family were copies of the original blueprints. As far as I can ascertain, There are no known Katy Berg and C blueprints in any archives, so to have even these reprints is very exciting. Let's take a walk through this magnificent home. To help us visualize what this home might have looked like, I'm going to read to you some excerpts from grandson George Griswold's memory book. Fox Hill looked much like a French chateau. The interior was also European in style. Much of the furniture and many of the paintings had been purchased in Europe by the Bridgemans during their travels. They habitually bought things for the house and sent them back to Norfolk from all over the world. There were large stone pillars at the entrance to the driveway with huge iron gates. Handsome wrought iron light fixtures were on each side. A long curving driveway between rows of red and green maples gave a good view of the house as visitors approached. The entrance was on the back of the house, on the side by the rising hill, where there was a porte-cochere to keep out the rain and snow. Often in winter, however, the north and northwest wind funneled through and blew the snow fiercely across the tiled entryway. There were 2 sets of mahogany doors with lead and cut glass and some stained glass. An elaborate reception room was to the right of this impressive entrance, leading to the drawing room. On the left was a large open stairway with a dark red carpet rising up to the bedroom floor. Wide and curving around 180 degrees, it made for a grand entrance into the hall. The banister was also made irresistible sliding, although the potted palm at the lintel by the foot of the stairs presented a hazard in stopping. Portraits of severe-looking ancestors looked down from the walls, and stained glass windows provided light. The formal drawing room, with French silk wall coverings, was large, with a curved end and a picture window looking over what was called the North Piazza. There were heavy yellow silk draperies, and all the furnishings were French Louis XV style. In glass cases were collections of rare fans and precious glass paperweights. The piano, a Steinway, was one of only 4 specially built with and inlaid with fine woods. According to the celebrated musicians who played it, the tone and action were exceptional. The central hall, directly in front of the main entrance, was a large square room paneled in oak on walls and ceiling, and was noted for its handsome workmanship. A huge fireplace with a mantel 8 feet above the floor was edged with dark green marble. Huge logs, which took 2 men to carry, were sometimes burned there. The black iron fittings and andirons were specially designed to fit in its massive scale. Even the poker was hard to lift. The light fixtures were also made locally of black iron. Sliding doors separated it from the drawing room, and there was a large picture window with a window seat, where the view was to the west across the valley. You could see the mountains in the distance that were in Massachusetts. A door on one side led to the dining room. On the other was a hall with a powder room, billiard room, and a fine billiard table, and a library at the end. An elevator was also off that hall, whose walls were of polished golden wood. Coats of arms hung high above the doorways and the mantel. The dining room was oval, with a gold-leafed ceiling and mahogany fixtures built into one end, and a mahogany mantel and marble surrounding a fireplace on the other. Just before arriving at the dining room, there was a small sunroom usually filled with flowers. The kitchen was on the ground floor, and food was sent up to the butler's pantry by elevator or dumbwaiter. When the house was first built, gas was used. Soon, however, electricity was installed. Voice tubes were used for internal communication. First, to attract attention, one would blow against the mouthpiece. This would send a whistle sound to the chosen destination. When a response was heard, communication could begin. Breakfast, for example, would be sent up by the dumbwaiter to the bedroom floor. Indicators in the servants' quarters told where the calls were coming from. When telephones arrived, Fox Hill had one of the first. The number was 26. To call the barn, the number was 144. The ground floor furnace room seemed much like the boiler room from an Atlantic steamship. Vast amounts of coal was burned. There were other unusual conveniences to this new home. A powerful central vacuum system, for example, was in the utility area on the ground floor. Hoses just had to be snapped into convenient outlets throughout the house for cleaning. Built mostly of local Connecticut stone, a light gray marble, which was very much like granite. A whole quarry was used, and the horses drew the large blocks up the side of the hill to the site where the house was being built. There were 2 layers of brick behind 2 and 3 foot wide stone exterior, and brick fire stops were every 3 feet throughout the floors and walls of the house. Windows set in the towers were curved to match the outside, both the frames and the glass. Warren Corbally served as general manager of the estate. William Wayland was the butler, and Marie, his wife, was Mrs. Bridgman's French maid. Sarah was in charge of the bedroom floor. William was responsible for the first. Warren also was generally responsible for the children, Eldridge and Isabel, while their parents were traveling extensively through the year. The 2 children had a succession of nurses, but none of them lasted very long, and Warren was in loco parentis when they went away to boarding schools. Warren handled whatever came up while the Bridgmans were gone. Warren had an apartment upstairs in the barn and an office on the ground floor of the house. Other servants lived in the house and some in town. As I remember my grandfather, Henry Bridgman, he was always immaculately dressed. He was a fairly small man with a trim figure. He usually wore a suit and a vest, and his shirt collar was stiff and quite high. The collar points pointed up, not down. His cuffs were also starched stiff, and he wore cufflinks. He was really quite elegant, especially for a gentleman in a small rural village in Connecticut. He usually walked with a cane and always wore a hat outside. At the foot of the stairs, in the room underneath the last sweep of the staircase, there was always a large number of fine canes and umbrellas made out of rare woods with silver and gold bands for his name or initials. Sometimes they were also kept to the right of the front entrance in the mahogany and glass vestibule we used to call the ticket office. As a young boy, I went on a lot of walks with him. We did a lot of talking. He wore tweed suits a lot, and they were heavy and felt sort of scratchy when I sat on his lap or walked next to him. I think he enjoyed talking with me, as he didn't seem to have many others around with whom to talk. He seemed to love these walks, and as I recall, he didn't talk to me like I was just a little kid, but made me feel more like a real person. I liked that. My grandmother was busy, and everyone else had their duties and things to do. He talked with William when he ate his breakfast alone in the dining room. My grandmother always ate her breakfast in her room. At the dining table, he of course sat at the end opposite my grandmother. Often there were guests. When I was included, I was usually seated near him, and I watched him a lot. He played second fiddle to my grandmother, and he loved to watch her tell stories, even though he had heard them 100 times. He sometimes came in at just the right question at the right time to help her make an amusing point. Generally, he sat back and let her carry the ball. He kept his eye out for me, though, and made sure I wasn't forgotten. It became a tradition that whenever someone complimented a dish we were served, such as strawberries in winter or anything special, he would quietly say to the butler, William, "Where did these strawberries come from?" And William, with a straight face, would always reply, "From the hill, sir," referring to Fox Hill's gardens, no matter how impossible it might be to have had strawberries in the middle of winter. And my grandfather would smile with pleasure and enjoy the guest's reaction. Henry Bridgman was a gentleman of the old school, courteous and kindly to everyone. George goes on to comment a little bit about the second floor, or the bedroom floors. He writes, "His room was across the hall from my grandmother's room. It wasn't nearly as nice. His view was of the side of the hill, mostly trees and rocks. My grandmother looked far to the south and west, and the northwest, where you could see the mountains in New York State and Massachusetts, as well as in Connecticut. She had a separate dressing room, which led to another room called the lilac room, which had closets with her coats, dresses, and hats. In a large closet in her dressing room, behind some of her robes and nightclothes, was a big black iron safe with heavy metal wheels. I wondered if it wasn't too heavy for the floor. I couldn't budge it. Her door was usually open, and I wandered into my grandmother's room a lot. It was sort of center of things. It was mostly pink and white. Sarah, her upstairs maid, would be there, and that's where plans were worked out. The mail and the newspapers were brought there, and my grandmother handled her correspondence and instructions for meals and whatever was going on. The dumbwaiter access was in the hall right next to her door, and voice tubes to everywhere were lined up on the wall next to her bed. Once, though, when I think the door was ajar, I walked in and found her in bed without her wig on. I beat a hasty retreat, but now I know. George continues to write, I was vaguely aware that my grandfather had been in the book publishing business, but I don't recall ever hearing it discussed. My father and mother never told me anything that I remember about Henry Bridgman's business career or his family. The Bridgmans used their home as a setting for much public good. Alice's dedication to philanthropy ran deep. Not only did she provide the town with a cultural venue, but she made sure it was utilized. The Bridgmans hosted a yearly Lincoln's birthday concert for almost 20 years, and the list of notable artists will amaze you. Then along came the First World War. This, of course, changed everything. Son Eldridge, just 17 years old, intended to enlist with the French Air Force. He was instead directed to the French Ambulance Corps. Alice and Henry had a custom-built ambulance made and shipped to Europe. One assumes, thinking it would help their son. A news clipping gives one the sense of the times. At home, the Bridgmans turned over the gymnasium to the Connecticut Guard. The state required all towns to train a minimum of 58 men. The Bridgmans also provided them with rifles, ammunition, and a shooting range, which they created at Fox Hill, so the local men would have a place to practice. On the lighter side, Alice continued with a tradition she had started in 1912 of lighting the large evergreen tree on the town green. It is reported this was the second such tree in the country at the time to have been lit. The Bridgmans were also well known for providing a turkey to many Norfolkians during the holiday season. Back at home, daughter Isabel was doing her part, and another magnificent wedding is planned. The local newspaper writes, Miss Bridgman, bride of George Griswold. Bridegroom is lineal descendant of 3 Connecticut governors. Mid-June was greeted in Norfolk with a fashionable wedding at the Church of Christ Congregational. Miss Isabel Battelle Bridgman, only daughter of Honorable and Mrs. Henry H. Bridgman, and niece of the Mrs. Mary and Isabella Eldridge, became the bride of George Griswold, U.S.N., only son of the late George Griswold of New York and Tuxedo Park, New York. The bride was attended by 4 bridesmaids: Miss Fay Alger of Detroit, Michigan, Miss Grace Parker of New Haven, Miss Grace Hartley Jenkins of New York, and Miss Mary Case of Englewood, New Jersey. The bride was charming in a gown of silver tissue with net covered with point lace, which was worn by her mother on her wedding day 25 years ago, and a court train of point lace lined with silver tissue, which was her mother's wedding veil. Her veil of tulle was caught up with orange blossoms, which ornamented her mother's wedding veil. She wore a string of pearls and carried a bouquet of lilies of the valley and orchids. A reception was held at Fox Hill, the Bridgman home, after the ceremony. A stringed orchestra furnished music, and Sherry of New York furnished the refreshments. Relatives and friends of the bride and groom were largely represented at the church and the reception, a large contingent coming from Tuxedo Park. The day was perfect weather-wise, and in the large throng attending the wedding were many prominent people from New England, New York, and other states. Scores of guests motored to Norfolk, while many others came in a special Pullman attached to the noon train. Mr. and Mrs. Griswold received many costly and beautiful gifts. The 20th century brought all sorts of new things to Fox Hill. Alice was the head of the Women Against Suffrage Committee in Connecticut. This is a story we haven't been able to fully investigate, and we don't know all the details of it yet. But we do know that Alice, in 1919, gave the town her gymnasium building for its town hall. And this was the place where the women of Norfolk came to register for the vote. Alice and Isabel were among the first 80 women to do so. So somewhere along the line, she must have changed her mind. The 1920s ushered in a new era for the Bridgmans at Fox Hill. They continued to travel abroad and act as host to the continuance of all their cultural and social philanthropies. Alice picked up the reins after sisters Isabella and Mary died and hosted the annual Christmas events for all Norfolk children. The 1920s also brought the Bridgmans grandchildren. Daughter Isabel had 2 sons, George and Henry. The end of the 1920s brought change to the Bridgman household. Henry dies in 1928 after a brief illness. Son Eldridge, who now resides in California, dies in 1930 after many years of ill health, perhaps the effects from the double influenza he suffered during the Great War. At the close of the summer of 1935, Alice, at the age of 84, dies peacefully at Fox Hill, the majestic home she had built in her beloved hometown of Norfolk. A life well lived, dedicated to helping others and her community. As sole heir, Isabel and George inherit Fox Hill. For many years they come to the castle on the hill. Son George writes, "For a young boy growing up in this vast stone chateau with its towers, verandas, piazzas, and many rooms and closets, it was like living a real fairy tale." Among my discoveries were some souvenirs of the World War, which Eldridge had brought back, a bayonet, a German helmet, and various postcards and posters. Eventually, the room that had been Eldridge's became mine. It was next to my grandmother's room, and at the opposite end of the house from my father and mother. It was redecorated with furniture and colors more or less selected by me. The furniture was black, my towels were black with red initials, and the ceiling was silver. The walls were covered in blue wallpaper. Henry and Elsa were great people and were very good to me. Elsa was a marvelous cook. When I was at Yale, I would bring friends to Fox Hill on weekends, and they took care of us. As a matter of fact, they spoiled me as much as they could. Naturally, I loved it. The Griswolds seem to have enjoyed the family home. The onset of World War II brought about the next set of changes to Fox Hill. According to the family papers, George and Isabel let the caretakers of Fox Hill go, who were of German descent. Following the war, with the increase of property taxes, Fox Hill was assessed at over $100,000, with a tax of $1,750, the equivalent of about $20,000 today, and carrying the great costs of heating the massive home, which consumed mountains of coal. The Griswolds came up with a plan. Demolish the great house, but save the favorite room. The following photos tell the story of removing the hall and sending it up the hill to a new foundation. A modest home was built around the hall that was once the centerpiece of one of Norfolk's grandest homes. The Griswolds named their new house Fox Hall. Isabel and George enjoyed this new home and a camp they built on Doolittle Lake for many years, continuing to host large gatherings with friends, including an annual New Year's party in the old Fox Hill carriage barn, and summers with the grandchildren. The remnants of Norfolk's castle on the hill served the family well. In the late 1970s, the Griswold family sold the property to the current owners of Fox Hall, who, for the last 40 years, have made this unique house and property with an amazing history their own. Thank you for joining us on this virtual tour of Fox Hill, and again for joining us here in Fox Hall. We hope you've enjoyed this video as much as we have in bringing it to you.